Okay.
Yeah. Greetings. I'm so happy to be here at last and celebrate this collection. I spent literally 40 years building. It was the first big rare book collection I got involved in. A little about me: I grew up in Evansville, Indiana, and I was always a bookish kid, preferred reading to sports or anything else. And it was only natural that I would end up a bookseller because I couldn't figure out what else to do. I tried teaching for 1 year. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I became a vegetarian in the 60s and was a vegetarian for 35 years. I know I'm going to get that question, so I'll head it off. I laughed a bit. I'm a pescatarian, ovo-lacto-pescatarian, I guess officially. I did 1 semester at Bloomington in art, graduate school in art, but then headed out to California and got apprenticed in a famous book shop called Zeitlin and Verbrugge, where I worked with Jake Zeitlin, who any of you who've read the history of book selling will know his name well. He started in 1929, a very irascible and colorful personality who built many collections, particularly the Honeyman collection. It was while at Jake's I met Dave Randall, as well as so many other collectors and famous librarians. Soon after I went to work for Jake's, we went to Arizona to pick up a huge collection. And as I was boxing this up, I found a copy of Koki's Pythagorean Diet. And I was just floored that there was an 18th century book on vegetarianism. So I set this aside, and when we got back, I asked Jake if there was a possibility I could buy this. And he quoted a price that I had never imagined I would pay for a book. It was $300. I made arrangements to pay it off over, I think, 3 months. And that was sort of my indoctrination to rare book collecting, and also polarized me as for this collection that I went on to build over 1,000 items. So having found that, I thought, well, I gotta keep adding to this. I had no idea how many things there were. There were no bibliographies available. And the way in those days, before the internet and without a bibliography, the way I collected was just going around to bookshops and looking for things, finding the health or the occult or whatever section, diet, cookbook section. And I was fortunate starting at the right time where I found lots and lots of things. Then I started writing to British and French dealers saying if they had anything. And in those days you would get postcards from people saying, we can offer so-and-so. And I kept adding to it. One of my great coups was this amazing bookshop in Long Beach. Maybe some of you ever encountered it, called Acres of Books. And that's a literal description. It was gigantic, probably had an inventory of 1 million books. And I found a health section that looked like it hadn't been touched in 50 years. And I made a very substantial addition to the library from that. And also bought all sorts of other things like hydropathy and early books on bizarre health movements, things that I later sold off as I decided to focus more and more on strictly the vegetarian diet. Another amazing coup was I was traveling in Michigan and I saw a sign for a bookshop and decided to pull in and poked around, and I found a whole cabinet of Kellogg books that were from Kellogg's own library from Battle Creek. How they turned up there, the bookseller wouldn't tell me, probably from a descendant who wanted to dump them. But those are in the collection, and some are on display. As I was buying more and more books, I then began to make a rough want list, and like many collectors do, you get one book and you read it and you find in the footnotes or in the bibliography the references. So I started listing these and then seeking them out. And the one holy grail was the Porphyry, the Neoplatonic philosopher who wrote a book in 1547, which we have on display here, the Latin edition. And I also have the Greek, the following year, the Editio Princeps came out, the Greek edition. That's the one book I really had to mortgage myself for, so to speak. I really paid for it. But one thing I wanted to kind of convey is in the part of the joy of collecting is you find lots of things at reasonable prices, and then you have to remember to, when you see something you know is really rare, just pull the trigger and buy it, because you may never see it again. So that's one I paid for and never regretted it. In fact, we booksellers and collectors have a little saying that it's the book you let go that you regret, not the one you overpaid for. The other book that I looked for a long, long time was John Newton, which is on display. It was a book. Newton was a friend of Shelley's, and it's apparent that Shelley was visited with Newton at dinner, vegetarian dinners, and that inspired Shelley to go on and become a vegetarian. We have on display Shelley's Queen Mab, which is the first appearance of his long footnote on vegetarianism. And that book was, that 3, 4, 5-page piece was published as a separate book, which is a legendary Shelley rarity. I knew I would probably never see that, but I do have several later reprints of it. And I checked with Joel, and Eli didn't have one either, although he was certainly strong on Shelley. According to my notes, there are 4 or 5 copies of it recorded in libraries in the United States. Only 2 had come up at auction: the Buxton Foreman and the Spohr copy, both in the 30s. Shelley also wrote a book, or they found quite later in the 20th century in his manuscripts, an essay on the vegetable system of diet, and that was published in 1929, and I did finally find a copy of that. So having accumulated all these books, I finally sat down and started cataloging them. In other words, really making a authoritative list with collations and notes. And little did I know that job would take me 20 years, and I'm still working on it. We're passing around 2 copies of the manuscript, and I want to talk to Joel further about how we can eventually issue that as a bibliography. No idea how many people in the world will care, but that this many people showed up for the talk is encouraging, and maybe 100 copies of that might be printed down the road. Collecting it's been such an amazing adventure for me. I was always an antiquarian by nature. Even as a kid, I collected all sorts of things: rocks, stones, arrowheads, anything old always appealed to me. And then at the same time, I was a bookworm, had my nose in a book all the time. So when I discovered collecting old books, I was in heaven, because I had the pleasure, the kind of intellectual pleasure of discovering, reading, learning something new, combined with the physical pleasure of owning something antique. They just go together, and I'm sure many of the people in this room probably suffer from this. been quite an adventure, and I have gone on, built many other collections over the years. I built, let's see, I made a couple notes. I built a collection on Will Bradley, the American graphic artist, and a collection of Claude Bragdon, a theosophist and graphic designer who kind of pioneered what we now call sacred geometry. Both of those collections went to the Wolfsonian Museum in Miami. Now for the last 6 or 8 years, I've been collecting desert literature of Southern California. I know that sounds kind of vague, but there's an amazing body of books, starting with the early railway surveys through Southern California, to pioneer accounts and local histories and so forth. And that collection's grown to about 1,500 items. And there is something where, possibly because I've had a computer since that I didn't when I started the vegetarian collection, I was able to sort of type up my notes as I went, and in this case, I'm including books that I don't have, which are effectively my want list, or some that I may have decided don't really need, but I make a citation. So in this case, I could actually issue a real bibliography, whereas what we have here is very much just a catalog of a specific collection. But I did think about expanding it, but then my interest changed. I keep expanding my interest, and I probably won't ever get around to doing that. But I do want to finish this manuscript and see it through. And I have a surprise for Joel. I found just a couple of weeks ago Anna Kingsford's thesis. Kingsford was an amazing woman, died very young at 40, but she was an ardent vegetarian, a theosophist. She was head of the London Theosophical Lodge, and she decided to go to medical school simply to prove that you didn't have to use vivisection to get an MD. She turned out to be the second woman to ever receive a medical degree. And she seems to be very little known, but if there's any graduate students here looking for a great project, she would be somebody to write about, because she was an animal rights, a woman rights advocate, and a fascinating figure. So I'm happy to add that, which we didn't have. That was on my want list for 20 years.
Well, thank you very much. And this, I guess, answers one of the questions that I had, which is, have you continued to collect in vegetarians?
This, I haven't actually seen that much that was an addition to the collection, but I saw that in a French medical dealer's catalog, and I snapped it up, knowing that I've probably never seen. These theses can be very, very rare, you know. So that's an exciting addition. And yeah, I will definitely keep my eyes out. Happy to answer any questions. And I wanted to give a thanks to Joel, of course, for having organized this, but a special thanks to Breon, who met with me and helped me evolve the idea of donating the collection to here. Thank you, Breon.
And I also wanted to thank several people on the Lilly staff who helped with the exhibition, Sarah Mitchell and Rebecca Bauman and Jim Canary and Jenny Mack in conservation who prepared everything, and Zach Downey who made the buttons. He's the one of our vegetarian buttons to commemorate the evening.
Any specific questions?
What year did Dr. Kingsford die?
Sorry,
What year did you
did Kingsford die?
die or live or born?
Yeah, Kingsford died very young. I think I made
What
a note
year?
here. She lived 1846 to 88.
Okay. 1888.
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
41 years old, and she wrote probably a dozen books in her young life.
Some of the other areas that you mentioned, like Will Bradley or desert literature, there were already existing bibliographies. So what did you use as guides, other than just looking for things?
Right.
for
Well, the case of
vegetarians?
Will Bradley, there wasn't really a good. There was a catalog, an exhibition at the Huntington.
Right.
But I added so much beyond that.
Yeah.
And often it's just a matter of putting the word out there, and people like you. I had some manuscript material, a few drawings, and so forth. Desert literature, there was an excellent bibliography by Edwards, but it stopped in 1970. So as I was collecting, I decided to go to the year 2000. But also, as I was collecting, I found probably 20 or 30 items that he missed, that he could have had. Yeah. Yes.
How many items are in the book, are in the collection that we have here?
Roughly 1,000. Yeah.
Okay, now that leads me to the question, how do you store and preserve these and the other things? Your house must be the equivalent of a kind of rare book library in terms of climate control.
Fortunately, in California, you don't have to worry about climate control. It's close enough to the ideal situations. We don't have the humidity that you do here, or the extremes of temperature. It does get hot, but we're going to run an AC on the hot summer months anyway, so there isn't any real issues for climate control.
And do you have special rooms for each
No,
collection?
no. My collections are scattered around my house. My house currently has about 10,000 books in it, so there's barely room to live.
One of the things that collectors in different fields become aware of when they start buying is that there are other people out there collecting in the same field.
Yeah.
Did you notice that with vegetarianism, or only when there was a crossover with another field like medicine?
Apparently had no competition in this until maybe in the 80s. I started to get a couple letters from Englishmen who said they were collecting, but they were always a bit cagey about what they had, and so I never really learned of anything. Then in the 90s, I did correspond with a young man in Boston who had a collection, good collection, and I believe he sold it to a library on the East Coast. I kind of lost touch with him, but yeah, in this case, and that's always good advice for if you decide to build a collection. Think of something where you don't have competition. And there's dozens of areas where one could collect. And that makes it a lot more exciting because you can find things. And I was never afraid to, I love the antiquarian things, but I would buy 20th century books as well because I felt they filled out the picture of what I was working with.
Did you set some goals in terms of condition? I imagine that maybe the vegetarian books as a whole, when you look for them, maybe they're less well kept than people who are collecting first editions of the
Yeah.
author they love and put them in special
Right.
stuff.
Yeah. Of course, cookbooks are well used, but yeah, I was always very conscious of condition, and in many cases, I upgraded books if I had a ratty one and came across one later that was fine. I would definitely upgrade it. And as I was getting ready, after we decided for the books to come here, then I sort of went through them and made an extra effort to make sure I had the best possible copies. some cases you just have to settle for a dog-eared copy.
What would you consider your most unusual or unique book in the collection?
Well, the Porphyrius, the 16th century text of this Neoplatonic is certainly one of the rarest and most sought after. And that's a book where you do compete with classic people collecting classical literature, Neoplatonic literature, occult literature. So that was kind of that was one I really looked a long time for. But I mean, there were constant surprises along the way. I found a cache of manuscripts of William Lamb, which I didn't really have time to work with too much in terms of exploring what's in it. So that will be a big thing for Joel in the manuscript department to explore.
The title of your talk today officially was Pythagoras to Gypsy
Yes.
Boots. Could you say something about Gypsy Boots?
Well, curiously, I had very little Gypsy Boots because a lot of them were published after my cutoff date. But Joel and I both remembered meeting Gypsy Boots in the health food stores in Erewhon and in LA. And Joel reminded me how he would always offer a date to people, sort of promoting his line. He was an amazingly colorful figure. And then the other part of the title is from Pythagoras. Well, Pythagoras, I don't really have anything other than some, I think maybe 17th or 18th century collections, because the body of text is not well known, and there weren't manuscripts particularly that they could draw from. So when I'm speaking of Pythagoras, so everything is really collected in the Porphyry books. That was Porphyry's main inspiration for his treatise on vegetable diet.
You mentioned the postcards for dealers, and did you keep all of your correspondence organized?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Did you keep all of your correspondence and with dealers? And
Oh, you know, I may have a file, and if I do, that will come to the Lilly. I think there is a file of correspondence. I wasn't religious about keeping everything, but yeah.
That can be kind of interesting.
Yeah,
just to
and
see.
probably I have a clippings file and that sort of thing as well. So yeah, I hadn't thought of including those, but thank you. I'll send them on by the by.
You mentioned cutoff date. What was the cutoff date?
That was 1967, which was the year I became a vegetarian while living in Indiana. Kind of arbitrary, but part of the reason for that was by the time of the hippie movement, there was a sudden burst of books, of cookbooks, and I remember starting to collect more and suddenly thinking, no, I can't keep up with all these new cookbooks, so I'll cut them off. Joel has a few on display that I actually have, like Laurel's cookbook, which is an amazing cookbook, and the Moosewood. But I don't think is that yours or
No, those are all the Lilly's.
yeah. So I partly because there was just too much going on beyond that point.
Yeah, and we're now collecting the post-1967 things. And one of the things that you can see in the exhibition is the Moosewood cookbook, not just the first published edition, but the first privately published edition that they published at the restaurant in Ithaca that came out a couple of years before the published edition did. And so we'll continue to add those things as we can.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. Tim?
I realized as you were talking that I don't actually understand exactly how vegetarianism and the occult intersect. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Well, in the earliest days, Pythagoras and Porphyrius, for instance, were very much something of a fringe sect, and a lot of their ideas would be considered occult in a very broad range. And then by the 19th century, the Theosophists embraced vegetarianism, or some of the branches people did. And I would say the connection is that they felt it was a spiritual imperative to not kill animals, and also not to, they often use the word defilement of the self, that it would impede one's spiritual progress. So in that sense, there was a strong connection.
And sort of along those lines, I noticed in your bibliography there that a lot of connection with sexuality too. And a lot of references like, you eat vegetarian, your sexuality.
Yeah, a few. I wouldn't say there was a tremendous amount.
I know several entries that they.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was part of an occult, but
Yeah, I honestly hadn't really thought about that. So,
and maybe health reasons too,
yes.
virility and health.
Yeah. Well, there was a connection with the whole hydropathic movement in the early 20th century in America, where just basic, what we consider second nature now, was kind of a shock to what people practiced. For instance, bathing once a week was considered a radical idea, and drinking water and eating fresh fruits, and not feeling real guilty about sex. So, yeah, I would say there was a connection in that sense.
Okay.
Yeah. But a good question, and maybe something to explore.
Once you had the first edition of the book, the vegetarian book, would you buy the second, third,
Oh,
fourth,
yeah.
fifth edition?
Yes. When you look at the catalog, you'll see second, third, seventh editions. Didn't necessarily make a point to fill in every edition, but if they came along, and often I might have the seventh edition first, and then that would trigger me to look for the first. And in too many cases in the catalog, there are where I may have a second or third and still lack the first. So I'll be on the lookout. Yeah.
Any other questions for Will? Thank you again for.
Yes.